Hayreddin, grace of the faith, guardian of the righteous. What a hellishly ironic name for a man whose name became synonymous with terror, slave trade, and bloody anarchy across the Mediterranean. Hayreddin Barbarossa, a man whose ships brought death and enslavement, a man who abducted entire villages, erased whole cities from the map, selling their inhabitants in the slave markets of Tunis, Algiers, and Istanbul. A man who, it seemed, was the embodiment of absolute, uncompromising evil, yet rose to unprecedented heights, becoming not just an admiral, but Kapudan Pasha, the supreme commander of the entire fleet of the most powerful empire of that time, the Ottoman Empire. How, I ask you, did this dirty, bloody, unprincipled machine for murder and profit manage to become not just part of the elite, but its absolute, untouchable peak? That is precisely what we will discuss. How history, that great prostitute, knows how to rewrite biographies, wash blood from the hands of executioners, and create national heroes out of the most inconceivable human refuse, if it serves its current narratives. Forget the romance of Caribbean pirates. Forget those childish tales of Jack Sparrow and his toothless adventures. Before you lies not fantasy, but a brutal, unpleasant reality, where every raid left rivers of blood, mountains of disfigured corpses, and shattered families in its wake. Hayreddin Barbarossa is not just a name. It is a symbol of an era when the Mediterranean was a boiling cauldron of chaos, and the lines between piracy, grand politics, and total war blurred beyond recognition. His fleet was not merely a collection of cutthroats. It was a well-oiled, ruthless, and absurdly efficient machine, capable of paralyzing entire regions, devastating miles of coastlines, and abducting tens, even hundreds of thousands of Christians into slavery. And this man, this architect of countless sufferings, this master of terror, somehow became not just forgiven for his sins, but elevated to the heavens. His name, which should have been cursed forever in the prayers of every European, suddenly began to resonate in the palace halls of Istanbul as the name of a brilliant strategist, an invincible warrior, a savior of the empire. How could states that position themselves as bastions of civilization not only tolerate, but actively utilize such monsters, and even elevate them to the status of saints? How could the Ottoman Empire, whose power was founded on strict Sharia laws and religious principles, embrace a man whose career was built on the trampling of all conceivable and inconceivable moral and ethical principles? We will not merely recount the dry, sanitized facts from textbooks written by the victors. We will dig deep, dissecting every, even the dirtiest and most repulsive, layer of this bloody history. We will show you how the political and social system of that time spawned such monsters, how they masterfully exploited its weaknesses, and how, in the end, they became an integral, albeit utterly repulsive, part of it. Hayreddin Barbarossa was not just a pirate. He was a masterclass in survival and ascent in a world where morality was an unaffordable luxury, and power and boundless cruelty were the only currency. His journey from an obscure corsair from the Greek islands to the master of all seas is a story of unprecedented, sophisticated cruelty, cynical political intrigues, countless betrayals, and how one individual, driven by the basest instincts, can change the course of history, leaving a bloody trail that still poisons the waters of the Mediterranean and echoes in the most terrifying nightmares. But to understand how a man with such a name could become the embodiment of evil and then a pillar of an empire, we must return to his origins. To the very first steps, to the soil upon which this monster grew, to his family, to the influences, to the events that broke him, and reforged him into an entirely different being, making him ready for the most ruthless deeds. For no one is born an admiral or a pirate. There is always a turning point, a confluence of circumstances that pushes a person onto a path from which there is no return. And in Hayreddin's case, this path was paved not only with blood, but also with deep personal dramas that shaped him from childhood, long before he became known as Barbarossa. We have already touched upon the chilling essence of Hayreddin Barbarossa, a name that became an echo of terror in the Mediterranean, synonymous with slave trade and unprecedented cruelty. But before we delve into his monumental atrocities and strategic triumphs, let's rewind. What abyss shaped this man? What alchemy forged the monster who rose from an obscure corsair to Kapudan Pasha, the supreme admiral of the greatest empire of his time? This is not just a pirate story. It is an autopsy of a soul warped by a world that did not forgive weakness. Imagine the Mediterranean of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. This was no azure coastline for tourists, but a boiling cauldron of anarchy, blood, and unbridled violence. Here, every island, every strait was a battlefield. Christian knights and Muslim corsairs, Venetian galleys and Spanish armadas, they all shared the same waters, often stained red. In this chaos, on the Greek island of Lesbos, a boy named Hazur was born. His father was a former Turkish sipahi, an Ottoman cavalryman who had settled on the island after its conquest. His mother was Greek, a Christian. This was not merely a mixing of bloodlines, it was a mingling of worlds, cultures, and religions, which could hardly give a child a clear identity or a sense of belonging. Rather, it was a vacuum that could only be filled by one thing: the ruthless pragmatism of survival. Hazur was not the only son. He had older brothers, and one of them, Oruç Reis, was a truly titanic figure. He was not just a pirate. He was a visionary who saw not a threat in the chaos of the Mediterranean, but an opportunity. Oruç was the first to raise the banner of anarchy, to begin building his own pirate empire in Algiers. Hazur, the future Barbarossa, was in his shadow, but it was a shadow in which he learned. He observed Oruç capture ships, abduct people into slavery, and build fortresses from bones and fear. This was not a school, but a bloody university of survival, where every lesson was etched with a sword. Oruç was his mentor, his teacher in the art of plunder, strategy, and ruthless power. He saw how his brother transformed disparate gangs into a disciplined force capable of challenging the Spanish crown. This was a world where mercy was a sign of weakness, and cruelty was the only currency. But even the most powerful pirates were not destined to live forever. And so, 1518 arrived. Oruç Reis, this colossus, this first Barbarossa, perished in battle with the Spanish. His decapitated body, a trophy for his enemies, a symbol of the end of an era. For Hazur, this was not just a blow. It was a seismic shock that altered the entire landscape of his existence. In an instant, he lost not only his brother, but also his patron, his leader, his foundation. His nascent, though already battle-hardened pirate domain, created by Oruç, faced complete annihilation. The Spanish pressed in, local tribes were ready to tear them apart. This was a moment of truth, a moment when Hazur, who would now be called Hayreddin, had to either fall or rise. It was at this bloody crossroads that Hayreddin made a decision that would become his point of no return. He understood that alone, as an independent corsair, he was doomed. He could not withstand the might of the united European powers. He needed an ally, and not just an ally, but a patron capable of providing him with legitimacy, resources, and protection. His gaze fell eastward, to Istanbul, to the rapidly growing power of the Ottoman Empire. This was not an act of loyalty, but a cold, calculated act of survival. He offered his services to Sultan Selim I, and later to Suleiman the Magnificent. He surrendered his lands, his ships, his men to the authority of the Porte. In return, he received not just protection, but something far greater: official recognition, the title of Beylerbey of Algiers, and most importantly, access to the limitless resources of the Ottoman fleet and army. This was a devil's pact, a deal that transformed him from a regional bandit into an instrument of imperial will, from a pirate into an admiral. From that moment, his destiny became inextricably linked with that of the Ottoman Empire, and this connection led him to heights of power unprecedented for a mere corsair, while his name began to terrify entire continents. This transformation, this shift from desperate survival to strategic alliance, was merely the first step in his ascent. But how exactly did he utilize this alliance? What incredible schemes and brutal adventures allowed him to become not just an admiral, but a master of the seas, whose shadow stretched from Gibraltar to Constantinople? And what fatal mistakes awaited him on this path to absolute power? This is where Hayreddin's true greatness, or perhaps his most audacious swindle, begins. We've already discussed how he essentially sold his pirate empire to the Ottoman sultans, but this was not a humiliating act of desperation. No, it was the cold, calculated move of a chess player willing to sacrifice a pawn to checkmate the king. He didn't just ask for help. He offered something far greater: an uncontrolled, self-replicating machine of terror, capable of paralyzing the entire Mediterranean. But now, under the flag of the Sublime Porte. Imagine the scene. A young but battle-hardened pirate, whose name was whispered in terror from Gibraltar to Alexandria, appearing before the ruler of the world, Sultan Selim I, and then before his son, Suleiman the Magnificent. What could he offer besides his ships, his cutthroats, and his bloody fame? He offered not just loyalty, but a tool. A living, breathing instrument of imperial will, capable of performing the dirtiest work without staining the Sultan's hands. He offered not merely Algiers, but a springboard for expansion into the heart of Europe, a key to dominating sea lanes, an inexhaustible source of slaves and wealth. And the sultans, those shrewd pragmatists, saw in him not just a former bandit, but an invaluable asset. They gave him everything: titles, a fleet, resources, essentially sanctioning his banditry at a state level. It was a brilliant symbiosis. The empire gained a ruthless enforcer, and Barbarossa gained legitimacy, inexhaustible resources, and virtually unlimited power. He became Kapudan Pasha, the supreme commander of the fleet, but retained his pirate soul. This was a deal that changed the Mediterranean forever, transforming Hayreddin from a local nightmare into a global threat. His first step, after becoming an official admiral of the Sultan, was to eliminate the thorn that had festered in his side for years, the Spanish fort of Peñón de Argel, or, as the Spanish called it, Peñón. This was a tiny but strategically vital fortress on an islet directly at the entrance to Algiers harbor, built by the Spanish back in 1509. It was a symbol of their control over the coast, a constant threat, a beacon that Barbarossa had to extinguish. Imagine an impregnable rock bristling with cannons, where a handful of Spanish soldiers defied his entire pirate might. This was not just a military objective. It was a challenge to his authority, his personal thorn in the eye. In 1529, Hayreddin, now with reinforcements and artillery from the Ottoman Sultan, began the siege. It was not just a battle, it was a slaughter. He unleashed the full might of his artillery on the fort, turning stone into dust and Spanish soldiers into bloody pulp. It is said that the ground trembled from the continuous volleys, and the sky was black with gunpowder smoke. The Spanish held out desperately, knowing there would be no quarter. But the forces were too uneven. After several weeks of hellish bombardment, when the fortress walls were reduced to ruins and the garrison almost completely annihilated, Barbarossa ordered an assault. The surviving Spanish were either slaughtered or taken prisoner, their screams echoing across the sea, warning anyone who dared challenge the new master of Algiers. But Hayreddin wouldn't have been Hayreddin if he had simply destroyed the fort. He conceived of something far more grandiose and sinister. He ordered all the Christian slaves he held in Algiers, and there were tens of thousands, abducted from all corners of Europe, to begin construction. With their hands, under the scorching sun, supervised by brutal overseers, he erected a gigantic mole, connecting the former Peñón Island to the mainland. This was not just a breakwater. It was a monument to his power, built on the bones and tears of his enemies. Every stone in that mole was steeped in the sweat and blood of Europeans, every meter of its length a testament to his boundless cruelty and strategic genius. This mole not only protected Algiers harbor, making it one of the safest in the Mediterranean, but also became a constant, visible reminder of who now ruled these waters, and what happened to those who defied him. It was an act not just of construction, but of architectural terror. Yet the peak of his audacity, and simultaneously the harbinger of his bitterest defeats, was Tunis. This rich, strategically vital port city, a jewel of North Africa, was a coveted prize. It controlled trade routes and was a center of prosperity and influence. In 1534, Barbarossa, already Kapudan Pasha, decided it was time to seize it. He didn't besiege it directly like a barbarian. No, Hayreddin was far too cunning for that. He employed his favored methods: intrigue, deception, and targeted brutality. Tunis was under the rule of the weakening Hafsid dynasty, led by Sultan Muley Hassan. But as often happens, internal strife plagued the dynasty. Hayreddin, a master manipulator, skillfully fanned these internal conflicts, supporting one of the pretenders to the throne, Abu Abdallah, to weaken Muley Hassan. When the city was sufficiently destabilized, Barbarossa suddenly appeared off the coast of Tunis, with his fleet under the cover of night. He entered the harbor, encountering little serious resistance, and exploiting the panic and betrayal, captured the city. Muley Hassan fled, and Hayreddin declared Tunis part of the Ottoman Empire, establishing his own, piratical, rule there. This was a triumph of cunning over brute force, demonstrating that Barbarossa was not only a sea wolf, but also a virtuoso political schemer. He didn't just conquer, he seized power by exploiting the enemy's weaknesses. For several months, Tunis became his new capital, another impregnable base from which his ships could control the central Mediterranean, threatening Sicily, Sardinia, and even the Italian coast. This was the pinnacle of his power, a moment when he seemed invincible. His name resounded throughout Europe, evoking terror and impotent rage. But this very triumph became his fatal mistake, his Achilles heel. The capture of Tunis was the final straw for the Christian world, especially for the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who could not tolerate such a brazen challenge to his authority and the security of his domains. Charles V, spurred on by the fleeing Muley Hassan, who pleaded for aid, assembled an armada unprecedented for its time. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers from across Europe, Spaniards, Italians, Germans, Knights of Malta. This was a true crusade against the king of pirates. Under the command of the emperor himself and the great Genoese admiral Andrea Doria, this armada set sail for Tunis in 1535. Barbarossa, accustomed to easy victories and sudden raids, found himself trapped in a city he hadn't yet managed to transform into an impregnable fortress. The battle for Tunis was bloody and fierce. Although Hayreddin had the advantage of local knowledge and fierce resistance, the power of the European forces was overwhelming. At the most critical moment, when imperial troops had already breached the city, a rebellion of Christian slaves, whom Barbarossa held in the La Goulette citadel, erupted. Thousands of captives, seizing the chaos, freed themselves and struck their oppressors from behind. This was a blow from which Hayreddin could not recover. His forces were caught between two fires, and he was forced to flee, abandoning Tunis to its fate. The city was plundered and devastated by imperial forces, and Muley Hassan was restored to the throne, albeit as a vassal of Charles V. The loss of Tunis was not merely a military defeat for Barbarossa, but a harsh lesson. It showed that even with the support of the Ottoman Empire, his power was not limitless, that there were forces capable of challenging and even crushing him. It was a demonstration that his audacity and cruelty, which had brought him such power, could turn against him. But Hayreddin wouldn't have been Hayreddin if he had broken. He retreated but did not surrender. He licked his wounds, planning new, even more ambitious operations that would draw not only Spain and the Ottoman Empire into this bloody game, but also other great powers whose interests would surprisingly intersect in this brutal struggle for mastery of the seas. For behind the scenes of this grand chess match, where pawns were people and pieces were entire fleets, lay far more complex and shocking alliances and confrontations than one could have imagined. We are accustomed to seeing Hayreddin Barbarossa merely as a bloodthirsty pirate, elevated to the rank of admiral. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, the bloody foam on the surface of a bottomless ocean of geopolitical intrigues. Barbarossa was not simply a tool in the hands of Suleiman the Magnificent. He was the living embodiment of Ottoman strategy in the West, a merciless spearhead piercing the defenses of the Christian world. His actions, his raids, his conquests, none of it was chaotic madness. Behind every strike was calculation. Behind every victory, colossal benefits for those pulling the strings from the shadows. The Ottoman Empire, of course, was the primary beneficiary. By granting Barbarossa legitimacy, a fleet, and the title of Kapudan Pasha, Suleiman gained not just an admiral, but a generator of chaos who tied down Habsburg forces in the Mediterranean, diverted them from the eastern borders, and ensured the unhindered spread of Ottoman influence. Algiers, Tunis. These territories were not merely pirate bases. They became outposts of the Porte, springboards for further expansion, governed by a man who knew no mercy and knew no defeat. Almost. Barbarossa brought the Sultan not only land and wealth, but also an invaluable resource, tens of thousands of slaves who built empires and fueled economies. It was a symbiosis of predators, where each received their share of blood and power. But who else, besides the Ottomans, profited from this bloody ballet? The answer is shocking and shatters all preconceptions about medieval politics. France. Yes, you heard correctly. Christian France, under the rule of Francis I, entered into a disgraceful but incredibly pragmatic alliance with the infidel Ottomans. This was an unholy alliance, directed against a common enemy, the mighty Holy Roman Empire of Charles V. While Barbarossa devastated the coasts of Italy and Spain, captured Christian cities, and carried their inhabitants into slavery, he effectively weakened the Habsburgs, drawing their troops and fleet away from the French borders. The French not only turned a blind eye to Barbarossa's atrocities, but actively collaborated with him, providing their ports for his fleet to dock, supplying provisions, and even participating in joint operations. Imagine the scene. A Christian king making a pact with the devil to crush his Christian rival. This was not merely politics. It was a dirty, cynical game of survival, where morality was sacrificed for ambition. On the other side of this blood-soaked chessboard stood the main antagonists, those destined for an eternal struggle with the devilish admiral. First, of course, Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, King of Spain, ruler of colonies. He was the embodiment of Christian Europe, its defender, its hope. But for Barbarossa, he was the primary obstacle to complete dominance over the Mediterranean. Their confrontation was not just a war for territory, it was a war of civilizations, a personal vendetta between two titans, each believing himself chosen. Charles V assembled unprecedented armadas, invested colossal sums, his prestige directly dependent on defeating this devil from Algiers. Beside Charles, his right-hand man and chief naval strategist, Andrea Doria, the great Genoese admiral, a man whose name was synonymous with naval greatness and tactical genius. Doria was Barbarossa's mirror image, equally cunning, equally ruthless, equally brilliant as a fleet commander. Their duel at sea. That's a separate epic saga, full of deceptions, ambushes, dizzying maneuvers, and brutal clashes. They respected each other as opponents, but hated each other as enemies. Their confrontation was a personal vendetta, where each sought not just to win, but to humiliate and destroy the other. And finally, a figure who often remains in the shadow of great names, but whose fate became a symbol of Spain's early defeats, Don Martín de Vargas. Commander of the fort of Peñón de Argel, whose fortress fell to Hayreddin in 1529. His defeat was the first major humiliation for the Spanish crown, a harbinger of future catastrophes. De Vargas's story is one of personal tragedy, shattered pride, and unbearable disgrace that haunted him until his dying day. He was one of those who personally experienced Barbarossa's power and cruelty, and his thirst for vengeance fueled the Christian world's collective hatred for the red-bearded devil. These people, these empires, these secret alliances and open wars, all intertwined into one gigantic, bloody knot, where every step of Barbarossa echoed in the highest offices of Europe and the East. The Mediterranean became an arena for a ruthless spectacle, where not only lands and riches, but the very future of civilizations were at stake. And in this whirlwind of intrigues, betrayals, and battles, Barbarossa's fate was just a part of a much larger, shocking tapestry that continues to unfold before us. And so, Hayreddin Barbarossa stood at the pinnacle of his bloody pyramid. Tunis, the jewel of the Mediterranean, a wealthy city, his new capital, a springboard for further conquests. He had seized it not by brute force, but by cunning, like a snake slipping through a crevice. But anyone who builds their empire on bones and tears eventually pays the price. Retribution was coming, and it was monstrous. Emperor Charles V, not just a monarch, but the embodiment of a European crusade, could not tolerate such insolence. He assembled an armada unlike any the Mediterranean had ever seen. Over 400 ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, knights, mercenaries, united by a single, sacred purpose, to wipe the pirate sultan from the face of the earth and restore Christian Europe's honor. This was not merely a military campaign. It was an act of divine retribution, as many believed. Barbarossa, blinded by his recent victory, made a fatal error. He underestimated not only Charles V's fury, but also the hidden threat within the very heart of his newly formed empire. Thousands of Christian slaves he himself had driven into Tunis, whom he had forced to build his fortifications, were a ticking time bomb. These wretched, tormented captives, humiliated and scarred, awaited their moment. Their eyes, filled with hatred, were an invisible legion, ready to strike from behind. And that strike came. As Charles V's armada descended upon Tunis, as cannons roared and the ground trembled under the boots of imperial soldiers, Barbarossa desperately tried to hold his defenses. His ships, his janissaries, his Algerian pirates fought with the fury of the doomed. But in the midst of the battle, when the outcome still hung in the balance, something happened that would forever be etched in history as his greatest humiliation and, simultaneously, an act of supreme justice. In the La Goulette citadel, where thousands of slaves languished, a rebellion erupted. Unorganized, desperate, but deadly. The captives, seeing their liberators approach, seized anything that could serve as a weapon. Stones, sticks, even their bare hands. They broke through to the weapons storages, and soon hundreds, thousands of yesterday's slaves, transformed into vengeful furies, poured into the city streets, attacking Barbarossa's garrison from the rear. This was not just a blow, it was a dagger in the back, plunged by those he considered his property, his tools. Hayreddin, stunned by this internal explosion, realized the game was lost. His fabled strategy, his invincibility, all crumbled under the weight of his own cruelty. He watched as his soldiers, caught between the advancing imperial forces and the rebellious slaves, began to panic. There was no time for anger, for revenge. There was only one instinct: to survive. Abandoning his new throne, his spoils, his city, Barbarossa fled. At night, under the cover of chaos and smoke, he, with a handful of loyal men, slipped through enemy lines, leaving Tunis to be ravaged. What followed was not merely a sack, it was a massacre. Imperial troops, enraged by the resistance and thirsting for revenge after decades of piratical rampage, stormed the city. Tunis descended into hell. Streets ran red with blood. Homes burned. Women were violated. Men were hacked to pieces. Children died of hunger and fear. Churches were desecrated. Mosques destroyed. Tens of thousands of inhabitants were slaughtered. Tens of thousands more were once again enslaved, but this time by Christian victors. The city Barbarossa had so carelessly made his capital was ruined. Its glory turned to dust. Its people sacrificed on the altar of a grand geopolitical game. This was his reckoning, his doomsday in Tunis. Yet even this catastrophic defeat, this personal tragedy, did not utterly break Barbarossa. In a world where power was measured not only by victories, but by the ability to survive in the crucible of conflict, his story was far from over. The true puppet masters of this bloody drama were only just beginning their game. And here we delve into the very core of this sanguinary saga. Hayreddin Barbarossa is not merely a figure from a textbook, not just a pirate legend. He is a distorted mirror reflecting the underbelly of human civilization. His journey from an obscure butcher to the admiral of one of the greatest empire's fleets is not a success story. It is an anatomy of power, violence, and boundless, predatory ambition. What lesson does this bearded devil, this slave trader turned statesman, impart to us? The lesson is simple and monstrously uncomfortable. Barbarossa's story is an eternal parable of how chaos breeds monsters, and how these monsters then become pillars of order. It illustrates how blatant banditry, when sufficiently grand in scale and profitable to the powerful, is not merely forgiven, but elevated to the status of state policy. Recall how France, the cradle of civilization, shamelessly forged unholy alliances with him to weaken Charles V. This wasn't just geopolitics, it was outright cynicism, where morality was bartered for tactical advantage. Do we not see this today? Do we not observe how yesterday's terrorists become liberators and revolutionaries become legitimate leaders if it suits those who hold the levers of global power? Barbarossa is the prototype of the modern effective manager, building an empire on blood and fear, then receiving absolution and honor from the powerful. He embodies the opportunist who, exploiting systemic weakness, corruption, and internal strife, penetrates to the very heart of power. Look at him through today's lens. How many Barbarossas are around us? Not necessarily wielding scimitars. They are those who build financial pyramids, promising riches, only to vanish with other people's money. They are politicians whose campaign promises are merely a smokescreen for personal gain, their path to office paved with other people's lives. They are corporations that destroy the environment or exploit entire nations for profit, then buy absolution with charity. They are adventurers who, using social media and media, create personality cults, manipulate the masses, and build their mini-empires on lies and hype. Hayreddin was more than just a pirate. He is the archetype of a predator who adapts, masterfully exploits an opponent's weaknesses, and most importantly, always aligns himself with the stronger side. He was not loyal to ideals. He was loyal only to his ambition and power. And now we arrive at the most crucial point, a question we might wish to turn away from, yet one that pursues us through the centuries. What if Barbarossa's story is not an anomaly, but the norm? What if, deep beneath the veneer of civilization in each of us, this predator slumbers, ready to emerge should conditions prove favorable? What if power, any power, is inherently a concentration of violence, and the only question is who legitimizes it and how? Perhaps, in condemning Barbarossa, we are in fact condemning a part of ourselves, a part of human nature, that has not vanished, but merely changed its masks. Is our civilization merely a thin film over an abyss of primal cruelty, and should it crack, new Hayreddins will crawl out, this time in suits, and with diplomas from prestigious universities? Ponder this, and the next time you read news of a major scandal, an unexpected rise or fall of an influential figure, or unfathomable geopolitical maneuvers, remember the bearded Kapudan Pasha. Because perhaps behind the scenes of that drama, something far more ancient and instinctive is unfolding than meets the eye.